I'm going to introduce Ambassador Robert Ford. Robert Ford, as he prefers to be known now, and he will introduce Ambassador Neumann, and then we will have their remarks. I would do that professionally had I the right remarks here. Robert Ford is the most recent ambassador to Syria. He was there from 2001? 2011 until 2014. He is the recipient of many distinguished awards for his professional service, and I am embarrassed not to give him a proper introduction, but rather than just fumble on, I'll get out of the way.
So, well, first, let me thank people for coming out on a chilly November night, and I hope this will be interesting for you. Ron Neumann and his lovely wife in the back have been friends of ours, of Allison and me, for the last, 23 years. We first served together under Ron when he was the American ambassador to Algeria, and I had the pleasure of working with Ron again when he was the American ambassador to Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. We were together in Algeria in the mid-1990s when Algeria was in the middle of a horrible civil war, a really awful civil war that killed at least 100,000 people. And Bahrain was much nicer. It was hot in the summer, but there was no war. We were there in Bahrain, for example, on 9/11, and Ron worked a lot with the Bahraini leadership, the King of Bahrain, to make sure that the American Air Force had access to an air base in Bahrain from which they then staged missions into Afghanistan. Shortly after the Afghanistan war, Ron and I went to Iraq, and we served at different times in Iraq. We overlapped sometimes. I ended up staying in Iraq much longer than Ron did. He always did have far better judgment than I did. And Ron was named ambassador to Afghanistan.
That's what you call better judgment going from Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, yeah, fair enough. I'll let the audience decide who has good judgment. So Ron was then and left Iraq in 2005 and went to Afghanistan and was the American ambassador under George W. Bush from 2005 to 2007. And you retired in 2007, but he didn't really retire. He promptly became the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy in Washington. The Academy is a small organization of people who analyze the State Department's budget and also analyze the U.S. Department of State's strengths and its weaknesses and provide analysis to the Secretary of State, to the White House, and to the American Congress. So, for example, a lot of what Ron works on these days might be the administration's budget proposals for the U.S. Department of State and how will that affect American diplomacy and American diplomatic capabilities in terms of having a qualified staff. Right now, one of the things he's looking at is there's been all this hullabaloo about Benghazi and the tragic loss of 4 diplomatic personnel in Benghazi. Ron is now in the middle of discussions with the Department of State about how to improve training of people on the ground to judge security situations. That is to say, how to avoid getting yourself into the situation they were in Benghazi in the first place. So he's up here with Elaine, really on a holiday, and I said, well, as long as you're coming, please come and talk to the group about how you see American foreign policy evolving. I have a sort of a very narrow, specific focus in my work and in my professional career on a handful of countries, especially Iraq and Syria. Ron has been much broader, from North Africa to Afghanistan, and now he really, in a sense, covers the world in terms of the State Department's ability to respond to crises and to get the right people in the right place on the right continent, etc. So with that, Ron, thank you very much for coming. I'm not going to go into all of the awards Ron has won. He's won a ton. So again, thank you all for coming, and I'm just going to throw out a couple of questions to start, and then one thing I have learned in my year up here is people always have a lot of really great questions, Ron. So I'm just going to start, and they'll carry us forward. But you and I were talking in the car when we were coming in from Burlington Airport the other day. The new administration is really going to have its hands full, and so would you mind just kind of outlining for people how you see the situation that the new president, January 20th, when they go into the Oval Office, whoever it is, Ron might have a preference, but we'll shut up. Whoever that person may be, what do you think the world that they're facing is going to look like, and what are going to be the top priorities? Is the Middle East the top priority? Is Russia the top priority? Is China the top priority? Is Iran the top priority? What's it look like?
Yes. I suspect that when the next president gets into office, he or she will find that it is even messier than they understood and even harder to decide what to do. But that's true of almost every administration. The sunlit uplands of policy always are much nicer than when you start going down the gritty slopes into the valleys and trying to make things happen with execution of policy. But to get more specific, the Middle East will not be the only priority. Obviously, we have some real strains with the Russians, some of which are in the Middle East, some of which are not in Ukraine. We have some real issues in China, the Pacific. But the Middle East is not a place that the next president is going to be able to neglect. If you, to be a little elastic, include Afghanistan and the Middle East, which is really normally true, but maybe it's forgivable because we have some of the same enemies. We have 6 active wars going on. That's a bit much. We have Somalia, places where we are carrying out repeated military engagements, killing people, and putting our own forces to some degree of risk. We have the little ones, Somalia, Yemen, where we're mostly helping the Saudis, but do some operations ourselves. Libya, where we're also engaged. And we have Syria and Iraq, which get all the press coverage. And then we still have Afghanistan, where we have more troops than we have in Syria and Iraq together, but to which the press pays almost no attention.
And how long has that war been going on?
That war has been going on now for 15 years, since 2001. We had an earlier period that was very quiet and got noisy again just after I got there, 2006.
Is there something on the towels?
Yeah. Well, you know, when you look at my career, there's several places I've been that you don't necessarily want to go today. Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen. What can I tell you? But the president's going to have to deal with this. Now, I'm afraid that the American people are a little bit the victim of bumper sticker discussion. Let's just go away, or we have to re-enter, let's just bomb them. These are poverty-stricken intellectual starting points to think about any of these situations. So I don't want to try to go country by country across the entire Middle East, and we have some strong relationships where we don't happen to be at war, too, including Egypt, Jordan, Turkey. We have issues with Iran. But I think for many of these, we need to start, the administration needs to start internally, but eventually it also needs to explain to the American people how it sees our interests, what it is trying to accomplish, how what it is trying to accomplish fits with those interests, what the means are, discussion very often. And I think we've lost sight of the difference between, as you and I were talking about the other night, we've lost sight of the difference between strategy and policy. How often do you hear people say, well, the strategy needs to be more troops on the ground in Syria? Well, the starting point of strategy is, what are you trying to do? What's your goal? Strategy is how you get there. You can change the strategy and keep the goal intact. But the first place that we need to have a discussion within administration, and we need to explain to the American people if we're going to ask for financial support, lives, political support over time, is what's the goal? How's the goal sufficient? How's the goal relate to our interests? Destroying the Islamic State is a discernible goal. The trouble is, maybe it leaves a vacuum to be filled by whatever radical operation comes after it. And it doesn't deal with the fact that there's an ongoing civil war, which creates space for the Islamic State and for other radical groups, including an offshoot of Al-Qaeda that's renamed itself so that it doesn't have to say it's an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, but it is. Asked Al-Qaeda's permission, would you mind if I rename myself? Which is also generating a refugee flow that is destabilizing Europe and that is putting strain on our alliance relationships. None of those issues are addressed by destroying ISIS, which is a goal. It's a beginning. It doesn't answer any of those problems that need to be dealt with as well. So I would suggest that there needs to be a larger goal, which is probably about how you stabilize Syria, which may be a much longer-term operation. It doesn't necessarily have to be all our operation. But what we do needs to fit into it. Right now, because we don't have such a goal, we have issues like how much are we going to work with Syrian Kurds to take Raqqa? This is an issue so sensitive to the Turks that it may draw the Turkish army into Syria in a major way. It may also tip our strategy into a cocked hat if we really aggravate the Turks enough on this proposition. But we don't have a strategic purpose beyond defeating ISIS. So from a military point of view, our military, working with Syrian Kurds, is consistent with the mission they've been given, go destroy ISIS. If you say, as some people do, well, using the Syrian Kurds to do that is going to intensify civil war and bring in other people, you get an argument. And that's a legitimate argument, but without an overarching decision about whether we care about the stability of Syria or not as a goal, there is no basis on which to reach a decision. You just have 2 points of view arguing with each other. The president can eventually, if necessary, make a decision, but it will be a one-off decision. It doesn't tell you what to do about the next issue. We do this repeatedly. I was part of a study in Afghanistan in 2012. We were looking at something called the Afghan local police. It was about using essentially militia forces. And one of the issues was, do you use groups that may fight well against the Taliban, but they're basically local militias under the command of some warlord, and they may indeed turn against the government in the future and destabilize the country. And I was having a lot of fun on the study. I was spending a week in special forces bases, running around the south of Afghanistan. But this was an issue of different point of view with my military colleagues. And we all looked to see, can we find a policy statement about the importance of the long-term stability of Afghanistan?
Oh no.
And we couldn't find one.
Oh no.
So I mean, we worked out a kind of workaround so that we could avoid having an argument and get on with the rest of the study. But there was no, and this is 2012. We've been at war 11 years. The Obama administration has had its double relook and changed its goals at least 4 times. And there was no statement that would answer the question, how is the long-term stability of Afghanistan to be regarded in terms of this particular issue?
So if I understand what you're saying, in a sense, the Americans are engaged in like doing different things with Afghans, with other countries, but there's no vision at the top about what Afghanistan should look like at the end. And so without that vision, without that goal, people could work in all kinds of different directions thinking they're doing the right thing, but they don't really come together to achieve this one vision or this one goal. Would that be a fair
That's
representation?
exactly correct. And then some of the things, well, actually it's worse. Because we do things like saying, we will not do nation building in Afghanistan. That was the explicit statement of the 2009 Obama policy review. Goals were weaken or dare to destroy the Taliban if possible, have an Afghan state that can maintain order and keep Taliban from Al-Qaeda from coming back. Well, to do that, you need an army. To run the army, you need a state. And to run the state, you need a coherent government, not to mention an economy. That's nation building. But we said we're not going to do nation building. And then we fund a lot of economic development, which all makes sense in terms of the logic of if you want to keep Al-Qaeda down and keep the victory we won in 2001 intact, you need an army and you need a state. But if you're going to insist that you're not doing nation building, then you have no explanation for why you're doing what you're doing. It's like a verbal pretzel. You can't explain yourself. In fact, we are doing nation building, but we just resolved that we deny that we're doing it, and so the logic is completely confused. So, without getting bogged down in each of the individual situations, there's an initial point that we need to say, what are we trying to do? And it's not just what are we trying to do, but what are we trying to do in terms of what does it mean to us? We've been at war in Afghanistan, as you said, 15 years. Is it worth staying? Well, clearly I have skin in this game. And so I know a lot, but I don't try to pass myself off as a disinterested witness. But the fact is, the struggle we are engaged in with Islamic terrorism, both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, is likely to go on long term. It is very difficult to quit a war on one side only if the other side still thinks they're at war with you. It hasn't been tried very often in history. The only example I can think of one side trying to quit a war, not surrender, but just, I'm out here, I don't want to have this war anymore. There is one example, that's the Soviets, right after the Russian Revolution, when they announced World War I, when they announced that they weren't going to do this anymore. Unfortunately, the German army continued to advance eastward. So it was not a very adequate solution. But so you have a war which is continuing. Secondly, we have made a lot of progress. Long way from perfect. I was just back in Afghanistan last month. And it is the one country of the 6 wars we're engaged in where we're overwhelmingly welcome and where people want us to stay, which is not a bad thing to be working with. So there are strong reasons to stay. You can have that argument. You can decide you don't want to. Our record has been that when we decide we don't want to stay in Afghanistan, we've been seriously hurt by what happens next. But that's a discussion to have. Then if you decide you're going to stay, you need to explain what it is you're staying for. And you need to look and say, realistically, this could be a long-term thing. Get off the constant policy review. I mean, it's kind of a growth industry in Washington. But we do, constant reviews. Well, the result of constant reviews are that nobody knows what the devil our policy is going to be.
And no one makes decisions because they're waiting for the
And
next
no one
review.
makes decisions because they're waiting for the next review. So one of the things the next president's going to have to work through is which cases do we absolutely have to stay involved in? Which ones maybe so exceed our capacity that even if we want to stay involved, we're really going to have to recognize that we don't have the means to bring something to a solution. So then maybe you have to think, okay, if you take, for example, Syria and Somalia, we're engaged in both. If you were going to say, can you put one on the back burner? Our back burner means we use counter-terrorist forces occasionally. We go in and strike people, sort of mowing the grass, and kill people, and they regenerate, and you go back and kill more people. Pretty messy. But it doesn't solve anything. That's been our policy in 6 wars, 5 of them. Maybe that's all we can do in Somalia. But also maybe Somalia doesn't present the same kind of level of threat that Syria does, where it's destabilizing Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan and sending refugees into Europe and generating an Islamist terrorist movement and Islamic State that threatens us and every ally we have in the region. So maybe you do less in one and more in the other. But those are fundamental decisions that an administration is going to have to make. And they're going to have to explain them. And then they're going to have to stick with them. And we could go on endlessly here, and I don't want to, but the last thing an administration is going to have to do, it's going to have to deal with what is the composition of our interests and our values. And that's going to be tough, because we'd like to be, we have real values about democracy and about human rights. And we have real interests about the economic health of the American people and the security of the United States. These are big things. Sometimes they're going to pull in opposite directions. Right now, they're pulling in very opposite directions in Egypt. Mm-hmm. We have a very long-standing relationship with Egypt. That relationship is important. It's important to maintain a peace treaty with Israel. It's kept the two out of major wars since the 70s. It's terribly important to maintain the Suez Canal open, which is vital to our economic health, world trade. And we also have an interest in democracy, and Egypt's really going in the wrong direction in terms of democracy and human rights. You're probably not going to be able to make a one-off choice. I like human rights, so I'm going to forget about Israel and economic health of people. Probably not. I'm only going to do economy, and I'm never going to say anything about human rights. American people aren't going to live with that. So it's going to have to be some mix. And then the president's going to have to explain to people a policy that isn't pure. That's really hard. We like simple, we like pure. If you can't have simple and pure, we're really unhappy. But a lot of policies are going to be like that. But that's what the president is paid for, is to make that choice. How much of one and how much of another can I have? And then I'm going to have to explain it, and I have to stick with it. That was an awful long answer.
That's okay, that's all right. So I'm going to sort of zoom up a little bit.
Okay.
And since people are going to, here in St. Johnsbury, I think a lot of people have already voted, and more people will vote on Tuesday. As we think about presidents, and foreign policy, you go all the way back to Vietnam, where you were a lieutenant in ground combat in Vietnam. And then you served the country for more than 30 years in the diplomatic service. When I think about presidents and foreign policy, I think about two things. One, presidents who put together good teams, because they can't do it all by themselves. They have to have good people around them. George Herbert Walker Bush had a fabulous Secretary of State, I thought. James Baker was just, and I was a young diplomat at the time. But I only met him a couple of times, but I was just blown away by how smart he was. And then I thought George Bush, the son, had Colin Powell, who I really liked. I'm going to ask you in a second about what kinds of things you'd like to see in the next next president and the next foreign policy team. I just want to add that the second thing that matters to me when I think about presidents and foreign policy is that they're willing to make decisions, that they take the time to study the decisions. I think George W. Bush maybe needed to think through Iraq a little more carefully. That's an understatement. But that in general, they did make decisions. We had to spend a lot of time in the second term steering him on Iraq. But he did learn to listen. The first term, he didn't listen. But the second term, he actually did listen a lot, and it got better. What do you, as you think about the next president, what kinds of things will you be looking for in terms of teams and in terms of processes? This National Security Council, as you know, you're down in Washington, I'm up here, but this National Security Council staff at the White House is getting a lot of criticism for being in micromanaging. What's the real proper role of the National Security Council staff at the White House? What should the White House do and what should the White House not do?
White House has got to set the goals. The degree to which it micromanages or not will make a difference. And it comes and goes. Remember, Johnson was busy picking individual bombing targets, for which he's been criticized a great deal. Probably not criticized nearly enough for not setting clear war goals.
Back to the vision.
Above all, the president has to set the broad goals. The president has to referee the differences, which are inevitable. National Security Council is going to change. Every president reshapes the National Security Council to suit that president. I think this National Security Council is a bit of a disaster. I'm very critical of it. Actually, I think it's a lot of a disaster. It's huge. Harry Truman started off with about 60 people. They're now, depending on how you count people assigned from other agencies, somewhere between 400 and 600 in the National Security Council. And every single policy think tank study of it says it doesn't work well, it's too big, it micromanages. Trouble is not just that it micromanages, but it's even at that size or twice at that size. It can't actually manage our whole government. That is the whole government that's involved in national security. That's just too big. But what it does by trying is it immobilizes the cabinet departments. And then it doesn't make decisions, which is, despite its size, actually it micromanages things by stopping them. It doesn't do real well at starting them. It does even less well at continuing. And it certainly doesn't do well at coordinating across areas and lines. So, ideally, my view, which is certainly debatable, is that the next National Security Council would be a little smaller, and that it would go back to focusing on being a broker between the cabinet agencies. Places to say, what's the president's policy? Is it being carried out? And if there are differences about how to carry it out, to get those differences refereed and settled. One of the problems we have, it's a huge problem, especially when we're involved in the military in a lot of places, is we don't have anybody in charge, except for the president. There is no place that the military chain of command and the civilian chain of command come together until you reach the President of the United States. And you obviously can't take every decision to the President. So when the ambassador on the ground and the commanding general or the senior civilian in Washington, the military, don't get along, 9 times out of 10, those things just fester. They don't get resolved.
So that could be an issue now in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan.
It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue because the military is often the greatest leverage we have for political change. And the military sort of understands this. Most military officers at some point will read Clausewitz, and his most basic proposition was that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Unfortunately, most of our civilian leaders don't read Clausewitz. We don't understand it. And so, but the American way of war is to separate the two. And tell the military, go beat something up, and then give it back to civilians and tell them to put it back together again. And especially, it worked well in World War II. That was effectively the last time that we had a clear victory with that separation of power. Maybe we're not, but that's kind of picking on a little guy. But it has not worked, did not work well in Korea. It did not work well in Vietnam. It has not worked well in our succeeding wars.
Mm-hmm.
It works to some extent when the ambassadors and generals get along, which they do sometimes. It doesn't work well when they don't, and it doesn't work well when you're just trying to use the military instrument to fix everything.
So I heard a story once about George Herbert Walker Bush and James Baker. And I want to ask you about the relationship between presidents and secretaries of state after I tell this little story to the audience. One of my predecessors as the American ambassador in Syria was there during the Kuwait War in 1990-91, and the president's policy, President George Herbert Walker Bush, wanted Syria to help us liberate Kuwait, be part of General Schwarzenegger's army. That was Schwarzkopf's army, not the Terminator. Schwarzkopf's army to go into Kuwait. And so James Baker called the American ambassador there on the telephone, my predecessor's president, and said, Ed, and I can't do a Texas twang than James Baker, but Ed, I want you to go into the president of Syria and tell him we want him to send an armored division, some tanks, to help our troops in Kuwait. And Ambassador Derigian relayed this story to me. He's now at Rice University in Texas, Houston, said, well, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, sir, I can't possibly do that. That's way above my grade. And there was this pause on the phone. And Derigian said he thought he was going to get fired. And Texas twang said, God damn it, Ed, do you mean to tell me I've got to make a trip all the way out to Damascus for this? And Derigian said, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, it's way above your pay grade, too. And I said to him, you did not say that. And he said, yes, I did. And there was this long pause, and Derigian was sweating, pack my bags, I'll be on an airplane, and there was this pause, and the Texas twang came on again, and he said, damn it, Ed, all right, go into the presidency and tell them President Bush will meet President Assad of Syria in a summit in Geneva in the next 2 weeks and ask them for a date. And what the reason I share this story is setting up a meeting between presidents is a very hard, involved thing that involves all kinds of coordination with the president's appointment staff and the National Security Council, make sure everybody's on board. And normally, a Secretary of State cannot just commit a president to go to a meeting somewhere. It just doesn't ever happen. Never. I asked that. I said, do you mean to tell me that Baker told you to go in and didn't check with the White House ahead of time? He said, no. He said, go right in. And I said, did you? He said, yeah, my instruction. And sure enough, Bush, and if you go back, Google it, George Herbert Walker Bush met Hafez al-Assad of Syria in Geneva to talk about the Kuwait War, and the Syrians did send the armor division, and that meeting was a couple of days after Thanksgiving in 1990. So my question to you is, Baker and Bush were like that, two sides of one coin. I mean, they must have known each other for decades back in Texas. Is that a normal kind of relationship? Is that what we should strive for? Does that work better? I have the sense that, for example, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, or John Kerry was Secretary of State, his relations with President Obama are much more distant. They couldn't possibly have either that kind of access or that ability to just commit the president to something. Is that good, bad, or what do you think? What should we be thinking about when we see the next president on Wednesday, and all the chatter on CNN will be, who's going to be the new Secretary of State, who's going to be the new Secretary of Defense?
It is enormously useful, important, and highly unusual, as you speculate. George Shultz had a pretty close relationship with President Reagan, but also was often at some opposition with Caspar Weinberger, who also had a close relationship with President Reagan. So,
And Weinberger was Secretary of Defense. Yeah.
I think actually the only other Secretary of State I can think of who had a relationship more or less that close to the President was probably Atchison with President Truman. And even there, I think Atchison would have hesitated a few times to just ignore, say, General Marshall. But there was an extraordinarily close relationship between them, which was continued in letters for years after the President, after Truman retired, until Atchison died. Truman died. Anyway. So it's very unusual, and you probably can't expect to get that close a relationship. But certainly for a Secretary of State to be effective, he or she has to be very close to the President. Maybe not quite that close, but they have to really be on the same wavelength. And when they're not, diplomacy suffers. I have enormous admiration for Colin Powell, but he had no relationship like that with the second Bush, and given the practically open warfare between Rumsfeld and Powell, it was extremely difficult to get decisions made. That is why the National Security Council and the head of the National Security Council becomes so important, to try smoothing out those and to raising real questions to the President to get them resolved. Awful lot of time we don't make decisions. We just go for another meeting. People would rather, they hate telling the boss they can't settle it themselves, which is kind of a human reaction. And so they don't quite make a decision, they have another meeting. And it's not new, it's not just this administration. I remember an undersecretary in the Reagan administration coming back from what we call a deputies committee, which was one level below the cabinet secretaries, briefing us and saying that meeting was as feckless as it was indecisive. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it means that the quality of the national security staff and the national security advisor become hugely important. They have to be seen by the major cabinet departments as being both on top of the issues and real honest broker for the President between the cabinet agencies. If they seem to be playing their own politics, then they end up dominating everything and immobilizing it. Yeah. Now, I have absolutely no doubt the next president is going to have a very different National Security Council, partly because every president does, partly because this National Security Council has been incredibly criticized. So the one thing I'm sure next president's going to do is change it, but of course it could be worse.
Well, we've talked about the Middle East in some detail. We've talked about president and making decisions and cabinet and the national security staff. So with that, let me open it up to questions from you all. And yeah, please.
So if next Tuesday Donald Trump becomes president, will it really shake up the whole bureaucracy, or will the bureaucracy still continue to do the types of things it's been doing? Is it, are there going to be a lot of resignations? What happens?
That's a really interesting question. Of course, that's the first thing speakers say when they're not quite sure the answer. But actually, it gets at something. There is a lot of discussion. I mean, I can only speak to state how I talk to people as Robert. And there are a lot of people worrying about that question. I think in the end, it will steady down. After all, foreign service officers, like military officers, take an oath to the Constitution. Civil service, I don't think civil service takes an oath.
Yeah,
foreign service officers and military officers take an oath. That oath was one of the first actions of the Congress under George Washington when it was sworn in, and it is in fact in history the first oath to a constitution rather than to a leader, a king. So it's a very old oath. And at the end of the day, I think most people are going to remember that. That's why, you know, the ethos of both the military and the Foreign Service is that you loyally serve the administration. Now, if you get to a policy that you feel is so wrong you can't carry it out, then you have a professional obligation to resign or at least ask for the assignment. There are a lot of people who say, how will I serve? And I think in the end, most people will try to serve if the president turns out to be Trump. Second question, of course, is will they serve if he orders things that they view as being illegal as opposed to being unwise? That's a different question, but cross that bridge when you come to it. He hasn't got to be president, he hasn't given any orders. Some of the things he talks about would raise questions about legality, although they would also be questions. But then some of the things that have been ordered in the past have been subsequently discovered or deemed to be illegal, although they were considered legal at the time. So I think the question immediately, I think the answer will be there'll be a lot of perturbation. Some people may leave. Most people will recognize that they haven't taken an oath and they'll carry it out.
There's a whole tranche, of course, of political appointees that are Democrats, political appointees. Some of them are academics, some of them might be fundraisers, whatever it is, who are in the second and third tier of the leadership, not the cabinet secretaries, but the deputy cabinet secretaries and the under secretaries. And if Trump wins, all of those Obama people, every one of them, is on what they call a Schedule C contract, and they will be gone the first day.
Of course, they may also, most of them may be gone even if Hillary Clinton wins.
Yeah, that's right.
The last time...
Some of them will be hoping to stay, but
many will be hoping to stay. The last time we had the so-called friendly transition, that is where the same party took over, was from Reagan to the first President Bush. And it was a vicious transition.
Yeah, I remember that.
A lot of people thought this was going to be easy, people were going to stay. Not at all. They cleaned house like man. And there were a lot of shocked faces within the first couple of months. So there will be a lot of people at that level to change. And that's all the more reason why you need the professionals, particularly Foreign Service officers, to remain in place, to provide some continuity and to provide for the new people, if not continuity of policy, because the elected officials can change policy, but some knowledge of what's been going on and why you are where you are, which often is not in the public domain.
Yes, ma'am.
The role of the State Department is to see to the security of American interests on a global basis. Where does the issue of climate change fall these days in conversations within the State Department in terms of planning policy initiatives and thinking about distribution of resources? How is that issue showing up in that place in the government?
It shows that it's not exclusively the State Department. Partly you have a White House office that works with this as well. It shows up, though, there is a Bureau of Oceans,
Environment and
Science, which is the State Department is organized into two kinds of bureaus, those which are regionally based, Africa, Middle East, and those which are cross-cutting for global issues, whether it's environment or business or consular affairs. There is a specific bureau charged with this. It is heavily staffed with civil servants who have particular technical expertise and scientific expertise as well. You have Foreign Service officers as well. They are the central hub of carrying out negotiations. But you also have experts from other parts of the government that get drawn in. You have working groups, which tend to be chaired by the National Security Council. That's a legitimate function of the National Security Council, is to make sure you have your expertise from other parts of the government brought in. And when you go for a major climate negotiation, for instance, that is something where actually it's true of almost any major international you're going to have an enormous amount of internal negotiation within the U.S. government about what your positions are going to be, because you'll have different views in different parts of the government. And so sometimes it's good, it's a necessary thing. We have to get our act in order before we negotiate with foreigners. Sometimes we spend so much time negotiating with ourselves, we don't actually have any negotiating flexibility when we meet foreigners. Some people say we make foreign policy without reference to foreigners, but that's the way we do it.
Can I just add on that? So, from what I've seen, the issues like climate change don't get the kind of urgent attention that, say, the war on the Islamic State does. Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, White House will spend a lot more time on that because of the war and security and terrorism. It's not to say they ignore the climate change, but if you were to like do a pie chart of how they spend their day on foreign policy, my guess is the tranche that climate change gets from the top leaders is much smaller than the crisis of the day that they spend with. The other thing is, just to sort of amplify what Ron said, you might have, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency will have a lot of experts on different climate change issues. National Ocean and Atmosphere Administration, or agency, NOAA, will have a lot of expertise in these things. And so they have to be brought in with Commerce Department, with Treasury Department. And so you can easily get a situation where, say, scientists who focus on climate change will be pushing for a tough negotiating position, but the Commerce Department or the Treasury Department will say, oh, no, that'll hurt business. We have to be careful about that. And this is what Ron is talking about, that ultimately the White House is supposed to referee that. Yeah, we'll go here and then
I'm going to let you pick that way. You're responsible.
yeah.
You two gentlemen are clearly long-serving career diplomats with decades of experience and seasoned, who have risen to the level of ambassador and have served ambassadorial posts in different places. And you alluded to the issue of value constantly as administrations change. I'd love to hear you talk about what you see as the value of people like yourselves who've risen to this level through all that experience versus folks that come in to become ambassadors. We probably get the impression as political plums, whatnot, without casting aspersions. One of our not too long past governors, probably by virtue of her birth in Switzerland, became ambassador to Switzerland. I'm just wondering about how you see the role of career ambassadors versus the ones who come in. Is there tension? You know, how does someone who comes off the street, first appointment in foreign services, they're now an ambassador, how do they get up to speed? And what are the pitfalls of that kind of process?
I think your Academy of American Diplomacy has looked at some of these kinds of issues.
We have, and I now, but full disclosure, I straddle this because my father was actually a political appointee. He was a university professor, but he was a little unusual because he was a Republican who was appointed to Afghanistan by President Johnson, which makes us one of the only two father-son chief of missions to have served in the same country in the diplomatic history of the United States. There'll be a test afterwards on who the other one was. But he went on then to stay there under Nixon, to go to Morocco under Ford, and to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia under Reagan. So he was a political appointee who served 4 presidents, 3 posts, and 2 parties, which is not quite the norm. I would, as a career officer, I would like to be able to say just, career good, political bad. That's actually not true, much as I wish I could say. We have, of course, a long tradition of some very distinguished political, non-career, that's the politically correct term, for political appointees. And of course, we start off with Benjamin Franklin. And in fact, we took the first 100 years of the Republic before we actually had a professional diplomatic service. What I've seen over the years is there are some very distinguished people who have been very excellent ambassadors, like Mansfield in Japan, for instance, in the Federal Reserve, who went to Germany, Lodge, Harry Woodson. That's not the same as your average car dealer who gets a job because they gave a lot of money. Most of the political ambassadors who go are serious people. When you have poor performers, if it's a poor performing professional, they tend to do very little. And if it's a poor performing political appointee, they tend to be making conspicuous errors of judgment. And then you end up with an inspector's report like you had about the ambassador in Luxembourg a few years ago, who was pointed out had single-handedly destroyed the morale of the mission and was leading officers to curtail from Luxembourg and volunteer for Iraq and Afghanistan. That person resigned because now we put reports like that on the web now, so that person resigned quickly before that inspection report went final. I'm actually, so when you get political appointees, State Department does quite a bit to try to orient them, and many of them want to do a serious job. They try to make sure they have a highly qualified deputy, as well as a smidgen of training, but probably not enough. And most of them are okay. Where I worry is in two places. One is what kind of posts you're sending people to, and the second is not about the political ambassadors, but it's about the balance within the policy-making positions in Washington between the political and the career. We did a study that Robert was mentioning in the Academy. In the mid-70s, you had about over 60% of the position, assistant secretary and above, were career officers. That's now about 25%. When you get up to the top 10 positions in the State Department as the secretary, 2 deputies, probably one too many, and the undersecretaries, 10 in all, you have now only 3 career officers, and one of those is about management of the building, so you really have only 2 career officers out of 9 involved in policy. Now, the others are all smart people. They're not there just because they gave money, and some of them probably don't even have that much money. Some do, but they're not there because of money. But when you bring in people who have not had any real experience with having to actually execute policy with foreigners, there's a certain amount of blind spot. There's what they don't know. Sometimes it's large, sometimes it's not so large. Now, a president's entitled to have political employees in policy-making positions. That's the way our government's structured. But when you get this far out of balance, then you're losing the expertise you've spent a lifetime developing. That, I think, is the loss. So I think that, I wouldn't say you should have all career people at the top, but you need to have a balance so that you're talking about the practicality of policy, how likely you are to be able to carry out policies, as well as whether a policy sounds intellectually attractive. And in the field, which is still a little less of a problem, but you need to be careful where you're sending people. And I think that care is now beginning to slip a little bit. So, in all honesty, if you send somebody who's an idiot, or at least acts like an idiot some of the time, to London. Now, that's not true necessarily of the current person, but if you have a poor ambassador in London, they will be a figure of fun to the British media. They will make us look slightly embarrassed. We will wince a little bit. But they won't really have any impact on U.S.-British relations, because we have have this very deep web of connectivity with the British government. Every cabinet department talks to its counterparts, and the ambassador's ability, frankly, the ambassador's ability to London to screw things up is pretty small. If we have an ambassador who doesn't know what they're doing in Saudi Arabia, or in Afghanistan, who doesn't understand, or Iraq, who doesn't understand the local politics, who can't communicate with people, who can't be persuasive, who can't explain correctly to Washington the positives or dangers of certain policy actions, that's really serious. And now we're starting to slip. We sent an ambassador to Hungary, who I think is actually doing okay. But Hungary is in the face-off with Russia. It's a country that is sliding away from democracy, back into an authoritarian rule. It's a tricky place. When you send somebody who happened to be a very gifted producer of television soap operas, you're doing a kind of crapshoot. In the end, she's doing okay, but I think that is a dangerous way to deal. We've sent a person to Argentina who has absolutely zero background in Argentina and doesn't speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. The country is on the, it has a very dicey economic situation. It has hovered between the populist government. It could have an explosion. And, maybe the guy will be great. But there's no track record on which to pick. It's just, he bundled a lot of money for a campaign. I think that's a mistake.
I would just add, I totally agree with what Ronald said. I've also worked for some career ambassadors that were complete zeros.
Yeah.
Won't name a name here, but I worked in Iraq for a career ambassador who was totally out of his depth, and I would pin some of the problems we're having now in Iraq to what things he was doing years ago that sort of set things up for failure. And he was a career ambassador, but he'd never worked in the Middle East. And to be honest, Hillary Clinton chose him. So this is what I was saying about picking people.
There is a deeper problem here. I think there's an underlying, unexamined feeling among Americans that kind of anybody who's reasonably intelligent can do foreign policy. We wouldn't, you wouldn't drive on a bridge if the engineers hadn't certified it. You hadn't designed it. You wouldn't brush your teeth with toothpaste that hadn't been certified by a chemist. But we think anybody can do foreign policy as long as they're reasonably intelligent, sometimes even if they're not. I don't know exactly where that assumption comes from, but it does seem to be deeply ingrained.
So, yeah. They'll come back on this side.
The Pakistanis have been historically terribly concerned about Indian influence in Afghanistan. And that concern has generated some very unproductive behavior on the part of the Pakistanis in Afghanistan. I was wondering if you had any thoughts how credible that threat actually is that India poses in Pakistan or in Afghanistan to Pakistan.
It is massively exaggerated. It is, I can't say that there's none, but it is hugely exaggerated. It has led the Pakistanis to be very negative force in Afghanistan, including the sanctuaries for Al-Qaeda. A lot of the suicide bombs that kill Afghans and our people come out of Pakistan. There are reasons why we can't just go to war with Pakistan, which happens to be a large nuclear state. But I think the basis for the Pakistani view is, to my mind, largely fallacious. There's a paper that I worked on. You can find it you can find it on the Brookings website or Foreign Policy.
Brookings Institute.
Brookings Institution.
Foreign Policy Magazine.
It was a paper that we did with former ambassadors to Afghanistan, former commanding generals, and former special representatives. So it has ambassadors Finn, Khalilzad, myself, Brian Crocker, Cunningham, Generals Petraeus, McChrystal, Campbell, Marno, and Dobbins and Grossman, who were former special representatives, all co-signers of one paper, and he has some negative views next.
So, come to this side, sir.
Turning to the retrospective view of diplomacy, can you tell us what happened and why with respect to the nuclear negotiations with Iran?
The administration said, well, I'll give you one view. I think everything on those negotiations is contentious. Let me be honest, I support the outcome. The purpose was to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, to put them under much greater observation and inspection than they had been. While some people may have hoped that that negotiation would also lead to some change in other Iranian behavior or breakthrough in relations, that was very explicitly not a purpose of the negotiations. So from the point of view of the administration, it got what it felt was the best deal it could get, which achieved its central purpose. That is, it clearly pushed out of the box of possibility a nuclear weapon for at least 15 years. And it created a series of inspections which go on a long time beyond that. It does not absolutely prevent Iran after that from breaking out, but would provide a much higher degree of intelligence and observation should they do so than we would have had before. And so instead of thousands of centrifuges busily turning away, you have a very small number. They have carried out their obligations so far to reduce the highly enriched uranium, other things. But that was one of them, and then defending or attacking, we can continue that one. But its purpose was limited. And it is interesting that that agreement is equally under attack in both Iran and the United States. Many people in the United States feel that the agreement is too soft on Iran, gives them too much leeway. The hardliners in Iran feel that this was a major mistake, should never have been done. A great deal of attack of the Iranian government for having led the West and the Americans so far.
Did I see another question on this side of the room? Yeah, sir.
I spoke quite a bit about the lack of overall goal setting or purpose currently. And you recited that currently we're involved in some 6 wars. So the world's greatest superpower facilitating 6 wars without an overall purpose. That's a...
Was part of criticism.
So to me, a bleeding heart pacifist, that's a crisis of historical proportion. And can you give me some perspective about that? Is that the result of your accumulated wisdom or of an institutional problem that has always existed and never gone away? Or is that, frankly, your... am I witnessing a partisan statement on your part, or can you just give me some historical or relative perspective on that?
Let me try. I'm not sure how satisfactory this is going to be. Let me break pieces. Part of it is, of course, the very intellectually much messier nature of the post-Cold War world, where we don't have the clarity we thought we had in, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. Now, frankly, that world was a lot more complex than we often admit now, but it had at least intellectual intellectual simplicity about it. And it has been difficult for administrations of both parties to come to grips with that multi-centric world and design policies, national security policy. Secondly, no administration gets to start with a clean slate. So you had, Somalia had broken down a long time ago. You have very distinct different wars. Our involvement in them is very distinctly different. Afghanistan was a direct result of the attack on the United States that killed 3,000 Americans and others in New York. That's what took us into Afghanistan. Clearly, I think that is still a defensible action and one that is worth persevering and succeeding in. The Iraq War, well, I'm going to really fast forward through some history here, but because this is pretty complicated, but the Iraq War was a decision by the Bush administration, which many, I don't know that it had any strong support in the career service. It had certainly some strong opposition. That was a political decision of American political leaders. I don't think it was about lies. I think it was things they clearly believed, and some of them were clearly wrong. That gets you a long history that I hesitate to oversimplify. But at the end of the Bush administration, Iraq, period when Robert was in and out, I left there in 2005. But when the fighting had been brought down under reasonable compass, an awful lot of what then created the Islamic State, you can blame some of it on the Obama administration taking out troops, but the vast majority of the political problem was a function of the Iraqi government trying to become a one-party government. Right. And that led to the creation of the Islamic State. Both Iraq and Syria were rotting away of the Iraqi army. So a lot of what you've now got in American policy is a response to a new threat, which I do not believe we created. It came out of a multiplicity of factors, some of which we helped to create, some of which I think fairly belong to some other people. My criticism is that in dealing with that, we have much too limited goal about destruction that doesn't have a larger purpose for how we're going to stabilize what comes after, and how it doesn't just roll one war into another war. Yemen is very, very different. There you have a war, it's really a war with the Saudis, backed by several other Gulf states. And there I think they're dealing with their own paranoia about Iran, and I think the Iranian importance and influence in Yemen, I believe, is vastly exaggerated. And there we've got a very different problem, is how do we do have an importance with Saudi Arabia, which I agree to the economic health of the United States for a variety of regional interests. We don't want just enmity, but we also need to rein them back. So I don't think you're seeing, first of all, I do not think you are seeing the result of where most of the professionals necessarily want us to be. I don't see the professional advice having, at least on the civilian side, having been taken very often in some of the decisions of this particular administration, not always in the last one either. You can decide whether the civilians were right or wrong. That's a separate question, but I don't think you could see the invasion of Iraq, the removal of the troops, the way we have engaged in Syria, or a good part of the way we're engaged in Iraq now as being the result of the preponderance of advice from civilians, and in many cases from the military. We elect our leaders, we get the leaders we elect. I think there is then also this larger issue of how you frame your goals. I don't know if that is a complete answer. It could probably be a semester seminar. I mean, quite fair, but that's a short answer.
Can I jump in
Yeah, you
with
should.
my sense?
You lived it up.
The gentleman. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Syria, so only 2 of the 6 conflicts. But as I look at it, it seems to me that it's a series of incremental decisions that date all the way back to the Bill Clinton administration and what to do about state collapse in Somalia, which the state collapse in Somalia wasn't something we did. It happened for a variety of reasons, all inherent to Somalia. Who cared to move that Somalia? But the problem of extremism established itself there in Somalia, and so the Americans reacted to that. And then similarly, state collapse in Libya wasn't really something the Americans did. Yes, we accelerated the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi, but he probably would have fallen anyway, sooner or later. I mean, he was not a popular leader. So people who say we brought down Gaddafi forget that actually the Libyans were doing the fighting. No, I mean, the Americans weren't doing that much bombing. So most of these, with the exception of Iraq and Afghanistan, where we made conscious decisions to send large numbers of troops, most of these were crises inherent in the societies. Libya, Somalia, Yemen, what was the other one?
Afghanistan.
There are 6. I keep getting 5.
Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria.
Yeah. So out of those 6, really only 2 did the Americans send a lot of troops in, which is Iraq and Afghanistan. The other 4 are sort of state collapse and the problem of extremism that came out of that. And my sense is that the administrations have just been sort of swatting at Islamic extremism without really having a game plan of how those countries could reassemble governments so that local forces, not American forces, local forces can contain the problem of terrorism, and we don't have to be involved in it. I think that's how I see it. I mean, I like you, I'm sort of impressed with the 6 wars. Not where any of us wanted to be. Yeah, Don.
How much of our involvement in the Middle East has to do with, well, Eisenhower's phrase, the military-industrial complex? It seems like it's our largest thing that we produce now is military equipment. And every state has a stake in it. So it affects jobs. Everybody doesn't want to cut anything because it affects jobs. But how much of that is controlling foreign policy?
You know, it certainly affects budgets. It affects the size of the military we build and the things it gets to use. I just have not seen that industrial security infrastructure really push for these decisions.
I haven't seen them push for a war.
I haven't seen them push for a war. And they push for the utilization. You know, to get your war, they push you to buy the best, glitziest thing and the most expensive one you can fight it with. But they don't, I can't see them pushing for a war. You can argue, I guess, that you have a certain revolving door and people go in and out. But I haven't seen, and I just can't think of a place where one of our wars is sort of driven by that industrial complex wanting to use the toys we got.
But I have seen them push for permission to do arms sales.
I've seen them push for permission to do arms,
Yeah,
no question.
Selling arms to Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates or whatever.
Yeah.
And one of the examples I'm watching actually with interest now is Boeing wants to sell jets to Iran.
Well, actually,
And Iran is in up to here in Syria with all kinds of atrocities.
they've got the permission.
Did they? Okay.
Whether they close the sale. Have we worn you out? Probably see you heard that. We're happy to go on.
When you guys started, it was in the age of the telephone and the telex machine. Fast forward.
We have traded in our quilt pins.
Fast forward to today. How does the threat of cyber terrorism and the issue of cybersecurity show up in your work as an ambassador in a country? And how does it factor into development of policy? Where does it rank in terms of threats that
The huge threat of cyber terrorism or cyber attack on the United States has not really come into most of the day-to-day diplomatic work that was involved in, or I think is still going on in the Middle East. That's much more the domain of CIA, National Security Agency, FBI, in defense. Robert may have had some more direct. Where we do get hit with it is the massive leaking of documents, the outing of people and secrets, and WikiLeaks, of course, was Snowden, and that was much larger on the cyber side, security on the diplomatic side. The big leak was WikiLeaks, and I think I think that many people don't really understand how much that did hurt us. It hurt us in two places. One was transitory. People, ambassadors that had to be withdrawn because governments were aggravated by finding out the honesty with which the ambassadors had expressed their views.
Gene Kretz in Libya.
Yeah. Good news was a whole lot of American journalists discovered, oh, those people aren't so stupid after all, they can really write. But I think the bigger downside was that the hardest one to show is what people will not tell us or will not work with us on because they don't trust us to keep a secret. And the clearest single example I know, which is in WikiLeaks, is the fact that we had proposed to the Pakistanis that we work with them to secure their nuclear weapons, and they don't secure them very well, which is a problem. And the Pakistanis refused that offer largely on the basis that it was too politically sensitive for them. They didn't trust us to keep a secret. Well, now that we've leaked that we had that conversation, you can be pretty damn sure they're never going to trust us in the future, which means that you're going to have nuclear weapons less secure than they could be otherwise. It's the things people won't talk to us about, which are going to be, I think, the most damaging, but the hardest to demonstrate or to prove, because you try to prove a negative what something that doesn't happen. I'm not so much where the people won't talk to us. We're too big, powerful, and omnipresent. They can't not talk to us. But they can be more careful about what they tell us. And I guess there is a third consequence, which is that people become more careful in what they report, that is, American diplomats, and that is a loss to our policy process. So that you should want your American diplomats to take the strongest, frankest positions possible inside the government in arguing against policies they think are wrong. At the end of the day, you want them to be disciplined and carry out orders when decisions are made. But you're going to get the best policy if people are free to argue and debate and try to push back against bad policies. Well, if bad policies are politically strongly supported in the United States, you get a whole lot less of that pushback if people are afraid that their views will be made public and then that their careers will suffer for it. So that's yet another dimension of excessive transparency that
I'm sorry, yeah, Beth.
I'm looking for some hope here at the end.
Okay, we'll try to do better.
No. I mean, these are very real and dire issues. When you have a chance to talk to whomever our next president is, what would you advise? What's the best path out of some of these quagmires that are out there in the world, whether we create them or not, and we're in?
Let me just go. I mean, some of these things are really hard. But let me go to one where I am deeply involved and therefore perhaps a little suspect. But I keep going back to Afghanistan, as I mentioned. Afghanistan's got a huge number of problems, but it is still doable. Just for pure optimism, I'm on the advisory board of a small girls' boarding school in Kabul. It takes girls from various different provinces and teaches them English. Went out and had breakfast with them last month when I was in college. And there's only about 30 of them there. This is just beginning. I was also with my friends at the American University. They're trying to get that reopened despite a major bombing. All the students want that. They lost 14 people, which included 2 security guards, one of the most popular professors, and 11 students that were killed in the attack on the American University. Everything I heard in Kabul, students, administration, government, everybody wants that university to work again. That is possible. I went out to this girls' school. A little girl, one was about that tall, and rattling away in fluent English. And sitting down having breakfast with them and saying, what do you want to do when you grow up? I want to be a teacher, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to be a judge. My God, I'm going to get on top of this corruption stuff. Okay, so I think this is a long, hard slog, but I think Afghanistan is doable. I think there are ways forward in several situations. I don't think any of them are easy. I don't think there are any silver bullets. I don't think we can have just massive commitments of American resources everywhere for years and years and years. I don't think people will buy it. But I do think that there are ways forward. I'll let Robert talk about Syria and Iraq. Hard, long, and none of them are guaranteed. If they were easy, I suppose we'd have done it. But I think Iraq is possible. Syria is hard.
Really hard.
Syria is really hard. I'm not optimistic everywhere. And we may have to make some choices about things that we can't do. But I don't think it's all blue. And we have done pretty well on the biggest one, of course, which was after 9/11, not to have another major terrorist attack in the United States. And bad as things are, we have not had, if you wake up tomorrow morning, something may get through at some point. Nothing's perfect. But in 15 years, we have not had another major attack in the United States. That too is possible. Add something positive, Robert.
There are ways to move forward in the Middle East that don't require more American troops and more American Air Force bombs and instead helping local people solve their local problems. And that would be my biggest advice to the new president, the new Secretary of State, the new Secretary of Defense. Give the people on the ground time to work the issues through. For example, I think we're rushing into Raqqa, and we're rushing into Mosul. The way we're doing it, we're setting up seeds for future conflicts. Rather than getting everybody together ahead of time on how it's going to be done, governance in these places. Governance is a very sensitive issue. We're just plunging ahead, and literally they're hoping they're going to find the answer after they've already finished the fighting, and instead they'll just have a new start fighting. So they need to take the time to let the locals figure it out. Shouldn't be the Americans figuring it out for them. We tried that in Iraq 10 years ago, it didn't end well. So give them the space and the time.
Maybe that's a good place.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming up.